There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after a hard truth has been told at the dinner table. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of people in separate rooms, separately processing, separately deciding what version of themselves they are going to be from this point forward. That was the silence that fell over Gary and Sandra's house in Westerville on the night of Thanksgiving, after the dishes had been cleared and the leftover turkey had been wrapped in foil, and Kayla had gone upstairs and Ruth had called her neighbor's son to collect her. That silence had weight. It pressed against the walls. And in the kitchen, while Gary loaded the dishwasher and Sandra stood at the counter with a glass of wine she was not drinking, it filled every inch of space between them. Sandra spoke first. She said that Carol had always had a way of making everything about herself. Gary turned off the faucet and stood still for a moment before he responded. He said, quietly, that Carol had not made anything about herself. She had responded to something that had been directed at her. Sandra said that Carol had humiliated Kayla in front of the whole family. Gary said that Kayla had done something that needed to be corrected, and that Carol had corrected it with more restraint than most people would have managed. Sandra put her wine glass down on the counter. She said she did not know whose side Gary was on. And Gary, who had spent 20 years saying nothing because saying nothing felt like neutrality, looked at his wife and said the thing he had been failing to say for 2 decades. I am on the side of what is true, Sandra. I should have been there sooner. Sandra went to bed without finishing her wine. Gary sat at the kitchen table alone. He thought about Dorothy, about the bracelet, which he had honestly never paid close attention to, and about the story Carol had told at the table, the velvet box, the kitchen table in November, the diagnosis. He realized, sitting in his kitchen at 56, that he had been present the evening Dorothy gave Carol that bracelet. He had been in the other room watching television. He had not known what was happening 10 feet away from him, and he had not asked. He thought about how many other things had happened that close to him that he had never asked about. He thought about how much of his sister's life he had witnessed without truly seeing. He put his head in his hands and sat like that for a while. Then he got up, turned off the kitchen light, and found his sister's number in his phone. Carol was at home when Gary called. She was sitting in her reading chair with a book she had not actually been reading. The pages had not turned in 40 minutes, and a cup of tea that had gone cold. She saw his name on the screen and answered on the second ring. Gary said her name. She said hello. Then there was a pause that lasted long enough to tell her that this was not the same kind of call he had made midweek after the October dinner. The circular, apologetic call where he moved around the point and hoped she would excuse him from having to land on it. This pause had a different quality. This was the pause of a man who had decided to say the thing. He said, I owe you an apology. Not for tonight, and not just for tonight. For a long time. Carol did not say anything. She let him continue. He said that he had known, for years, that Sandra's behavior toward Carol was not kind, and that he had told himself it was just a personality difference. Just the friction of 2 very different women. Just something he was better off not involving himself in. He said he had known that was a coward's framing, and he had used it anyway because it was convenient, and because he loved his wife and his sister equally and had not wanted to choose. He said he understood now that choosing not to act is its own kind of choosing, and that his silence had not been neutrality. It had been permission. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way their mother had always insisted things worth saying should be said. Carol listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I know you love me, Gary. I have always known that. But love that stays silent when it should speak is not nothing. You are right about that. I needed you to say this. Not for the bracelet. Not for tonight. For all the small things that came before tonight that I told myself did not matter enough to mention. Gary said he heard her. She said she believed him. They talked for another 20 minutes about their mother, about memories neither of them had visited in years, about a Sunday afternoon when Dorothy had taken them both to the park with a picnic she could barely afford and had sat on the grass reading a library book while they ran until they were out of breath. They laughed once or twice. When they hung up, Carol sat in her reading chair for a long time. The tea was cold. The book was still unread. She did not mind either of those things at all. Kayla appeared at Carol's apartment on a Saturday morning, for days after Thanksgiving. She had not called ahead. She had texted only, Can I come over? Carol had replied, Yes. There was something deliberate in the brevity of that exchange, on both sides. Kayla did not explain herself in the text because she understood that an explanation delivered in writing would be easier than the one she owed in person. Carol did not ask for details because she had spent 58 years being patient, and she could afford to extend that patience another few hours. Kayla arrived with 2 cups of coffee from the shop on the corner because she had remembered, from some family gathering years ago, that Carol drank hers black. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that, in context, was not small at all. It was evidence of attention. It was Kayla doing something she had not been doing, looking at Carol closely enough to hold on to a detail. They sat at Carol's kitchen table. Kayla wrapped both hands around her cup. She said she had been thinking, since Thanksgiving, about the moment she reached across the table and took the bracelet off Carol's wrist without asking. She said she had been trying to understand what had made that feel acceptable to her in the moment, and the more she thought about it, the more uncomfortable her answer became. She said, "I didn't ask because I didn't think of you as someone whose permission I needed. And I've been sitting with that all week, because that's a terrible thing to realize about yourself." Carol looked at her niece across the table, 27 years old, a good mind, a heart that was capable of this kind of honesty when it was asked to be. She thought about what it costs a young person to sit across from someone they have wronged and name the wrong precisely rather than softening it into something more comfortable. It costs something real. Carol told Kayla about Dorothy, not the summary she had given at the Thanksgiving table. She had time now, and privacy, and a niece who was genuinely listening. She told her about the walk home from the laundry on Broad Street in the winter, about the envelope in the kitchen drawer, about the Tuesday morning in the hospital when Dorothy had taken Carol's hand and said she was sorry she would not be there for more of it, and Carol had told her she already had been there for all of it that mattered. She told Kayla about wearing the bracelet to every hard moment, not as a ritual, but as a reminder, a physical, warm, present reminder that someone had believed in her before she had fully learned to believe in herself. Kayla listened without speaking. At one point her eyes filled. She did not look away. She let Carol see it, which was its own kind of courage. Before Kayla left, she stood in the doorway and said, "I want to know you. Not the version of you I assumed. The actual you." Carol looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I've been here the whole time." It was not an accusation. It was an invitation. Kayla nodded. She said she knew. She hugged Carol at the door, a real hug, the kind that is not performed for an audience. And then she walked down the hallway, and Carol stood in the doorway watching her go, with the bracelet on her wrist and something quiet and unhurried opening in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as hope. Sandra did not reach out to Carol directly for another 2 weeks. When she did, it was not by phone. It was a handwritten note, which arrived in Carol's mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in December. 2 pages, front and back, written in Sandra's careful cursive on her personal stationery. Carol stood at her mailbox in the cold and read it standing up because she could not wait to go inside. Sandra wrote that she had spent 2 weeks arguing with herself about whether she owed Carol an apology, and that the arguing itself had been the answer. She wrote that she had spent 20 years being quietly competitive with a woman who had never once competed with her, and that the reason it had taken her so long to see that was because seeing it required admitting something unflattering about her own motivations. She wrote that she had taught Kayla, without meaning to and without ever saying it directly, that Carol was less than she was. And she wrote that she was ashamed of that. Not embarrassed, ashamed. She understood the difference. She did not ask for immediate forgiveness. She did not wrap the apology in caveats or conditions or explanations that softened her responsibility for it. She wrote simply, "I know I cannot undo what has been done in 20 years of small moments, but I can choose what happens in the next 20. I would like to try, if you are willing." Carol read the note twice. She folded it back along its original creases. She went inside and put it on the kitchen counter next to the appraisal certificate, which was still sitting in its envelope in the place where things that have done their work are stored. She poured herself a glass of water. She stood at her kitchen window looking out at the December street below for a long while. Then she went to her desk, found a piece of notepaper, and wrote 4 sentences back to Sandra. She said she had received the letter. She said she had read it carefully. She said she believed Sandra meant it. And she said she was willing. Kayla's post, the public apology she had written 2 days after Thanksgiving, had been shared more than 4,000 times by the time December arrived. Carol had not anticipated this. She did not have her own social media presence, and Kayla had not tagged her or named her in a way that made her searchable. But the story itself had taken on a life that neither of them had invited or controlled. It had been shared by accounts that collected stories about family dynamics and generational patterns. It had been quoted in comment sections by women describing their own mothers, their own heirlooms, their own decades of being the family member who was somehow never seen clearly. One comment, from a woman in Tennessee, described a ring her mother had given her that her husband's family had dismissed as costume jewelry for 30 years until an estate sale appraiser identified it as Georgian-era gold. Another, from a woman in Michigan, wrote about her grandmother's quilt that a cousin had listed in a household sale for $8 before the family intervened. Another simply wrote, "This is about every woman who was ever quiet when she should have been loud, and graceful when she had every right to be furious. This is about all of us." That comment was shared 1,100 times on its own. Carol read it on Kayla's phone one Saturday morning and sat with it for a long while. She thought about Dorothy. She thought about how many women like Dorothy there were. Women of extraordinary internal wealth surrounded by people who had never learned the difference between what is visible and what is real. In January, for months after the October dinner, Carol did something she had not done in 30 years. She went back to Broad Street. The Hennessy jewelry store was still there, a small shop front between a coffee place and a dry cleaner, the same modest signage that had been there when Dorothy had first walked past it on a winter afternoon in 1991. Patricia Hennessy was behind the counter when Carol came in. She recognized Carol immediately and said she had been thinking about her since the appraisal. She said she hoped things had worked out. Carol said that things had worked out in ways she had not expected. Patricia smiled and said that was usually how the best things worked. Carol looked around the small store, the cases of rings and bracelets and earrings, each one sitting in its velvet, each one carrying a history it could not speak for itself. She thought about the person who had made her bracelet, the craftsman Mr. Hennessy had mentioned, the one who was retiring from the trade, the one who had spent his working life making things that would outlast him and whose name she did not even know. She thought about how much of the world is built by people whose names are never attached to the things they build. She thought about Dorothy, who had built 2 children and a home and a standard of dignity in conditions that would have broken many people, and whose name would never appear anywhere except in the hearts of the people who had known her. And she thought, that is not a tragedy. That is, in fact, the most important kind of building there is. The kind that does not require a name on a plaque to be real. She did not buy anything that day. She thanked Patricia and walked back out onto Broad Street into the January cold. She stood for a moment on the same pavement where Dorothy had stood in the winter of 1991 and looked at a bracelet in a window and decided her daughter deserved something real. Carol looked up and down the street. The city was ordinary around her. Traffic, a bus, a woman pushing a stroller, a man in a delivery uniform jogging toward a building. All of it ordinary. All of it, in its own way, extraordinary. She put her hands in her pockets and walked toward her car, and she felt something she had not expected to feel on a Tuesday in January. Grateful. Not for the appraisal, not for the apology, not for the resolution of anything. Grateful, simply, for the bracelet. For a mother who had understood what her daughter needed before her daughter fully understood it herself. For the gift of being known. There are lessons in Carol Ashby's story, and they are not complicated ones. But they are the kind that are easy to read and difficult to live, and so they are worth naming plainly. The first is this: what something is worth is not always visible to the eye. The bracelet sat on Carol's wrist for 30 years while people around her formed assumptions about it. None of them correct, all of them based on appearance rather than attention. We do this with objects. But we do it with people too, and far more often than we realize. We look at a woman who is quiet and decide she has nothing to say. We look at a woman who lives modestly and decide she has not succeeded. We look at a woman who does not compete and decide she has nothing worth competing for. And in every one of those decisions, we reveal not the truth about her, but the limitations of our own ability to see. The second lesson is about the cost of borrowed assumptions. Kayla did not invent her dismissal of Carol from nothing. She inherited it from Sandra, who had been feeding it into the atmosphere of the household for years without ever announcing it, without ever sitting her daughter down and saying the words directly. The cruelest transmissions between generations are the ones that travel in the air, the ones that are never spoken and therefore never examined. Kayla grew into a young woman with a good heart who had been absorbing a quiet, unexamined contempt for her aunt since childhood. She had never questioned it because she had never been asked to question it. The lesson here is for all of us. The assumptions we carry about the people around us deserve to be looked at directly. Where did they come from? Do they hold up to examination? Have we actually looked? Or have we simply been looking in the direction we were pointed? The third lesson belongs to Gary, and it is perhaps the most quietly devastating of all. Gary loved both his wife and his sister. That was true, and it was never in doubt. But he had confused loving someone with protecting them. And what he had actually been protecting was not Sandra or Carol, but himself. His own comfort. His own freedom from the difficulty of taking a position. Neutrality in the face of persistent unkindness is not a virtue. It is a convenience dressed in the language of virtue. The people who say nothing while the people they love are being diminished are not keeping the peace. They are choosing, again and again in small daily ways, to let the diminishment continue. Gary understood this at 56, sitting alone at his kitchen table. He cannot undo the years before that understanding. But he sat with it, and he called his sister, and he said the thing plainly. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. It is never too late to stop choosing silence. The fourth lesson is Dorothy's, and it is the one that carries the most weight. Dorothy Ashby saved in secret from a stretched income for 3 years to buy a piece of jewelry for her daughter. Not to show off, not to be recognized for the sacrifice, not to be thanked or acknowledged or applauded. She did it because she believed her daughter deserved something real, and because she understood that the most important things we give the people we love are the things we give before they know they need them. The bracelet was not a birthday gift in the end. It was a message, sent in platinum and diamonds across the years and the losses and the small indignities and the quiet triumphs, arriving intact and undiminished at a Thanksgiving table in Westerville where it finally said, in the only language that could not be ignored, I was always real. I have always been real. I hold still. Spring came to Columbus. The trees on Carroll Street put out their first tentative leaves in the second week of April, the pale, uncertain green of things that have spent a long season underground and are not yet sure of the warmth. Carol noticed them on a Thursday morning when she was walking to her car, the bracelet on her wrist catching the early light. She stood on the pavement for a moment and looked at the trees. She had walked this block for 11 years, and she could not tell you, with any confidence, that she had ever really looked at those trees before. There is something that happens when you set down a long-carried silence. When you finally bring something into the light and let it be seen and held and spoken about plainly. The world does not change. The street does not change. But the quality of your attention changes, and suddenly you can see the things that were always there. Carol had dinner with Kayla on the last Thursday of April. They went to a small Italian restaurant near Carol's apartment, the kind of place with close tables and mismatched chairs and candles and wine bottles, and they talked for 3 hours without either of them noticing the time. Kayla asked Carol about her career, about the promotion she had been passed over for, and how she had kept going. Carol told her honestly, not the sanitized version, not the version that sounds like a lesson, but the actual version, with the doubt and the anger and the mornings when she had driven to work telling herself she was not going to let them see it on her face, and then sitting in the parking lot for 5 extra minutes, because 5 minutes was what it took. Kayla listened with the particular quality of attention that Carol was coming to recognize in her, the kind that meant she was not waiting for her turn to speak, but was actually receiving what was being said. It was a rare quality. It was one worth cultivating. On the way out, Kayla held the door for an older woman who was coming in behind them, and the woman thanked her and looked at Carol's wrist and said, "What a beautiful bracelet." Carol looked down at it. She looked up at the stranger. She said, "Thank you. My mother gave it to me." The woman smiled and went in, and the door closed behind her. Kayla and Carol stood on the sidewalk in the April evening, the first real warmth of the year in the air, the trees at the end of the block just visible in the lamplight. Kayla looked at her aunt. She said, "She would have been proud of you, you know." "Dorothy." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she always was. I just needed everyone else to catch up." They walked to the corner together. They hugged at the point where their paths divided. And Carol walked home through the April evening with the bracelet on her wrist and her mother's words in her chest. Something real, something that holds. And found, as she turned her key in the lock and stepped into her quiet apartment, that those words had never been more completely, more perfectly true. There is one final thing worth saying about Carol and the bracelet and everything that followed. The bracelet was appraised at $14,200. That number appeared on a certificate. The certificate served its purpose, and that purpose is now complete. But the bracelet was never worth $14,000. That was its price. Its worth was something else entirely. Its worth was a woman walking home from a laundry in the winter cold and stopping in front of a window and deciding, quietly, and without anyone to tell her she was right, that her daughter deserved something beautiful. Its worth was 3 years of a plain envelope in a kitchen drawer. Its worth was something real, something that holds. Its worth was 30 years of a daughter pressing her fingers against it at a funeral, at a conference table, at every arrival and departure that had asked something from her. Price is a number on a document. Worth is the whole story of how a thing came to mean what it means. Price can be appraised. Worth can only be lived. And this story, Carol's story, Dorothy's story, the story of a narrow platinum bracelet with 3 small diamonds that sat in a jewelry store window on Broad Street in Columbus until the right woman walked past and recognized it. This story ends the way the best stories always end. Not with a dramatic reversal, not with a punishment or a reward or a final reckoning, but with a woman walking home through the spring evening, wearing something real on her wrist, in a world that has finally, slowly, imperfectly learned to see her. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is, perhaps, everything. Thank you for being here tonight. If this story moved you, if it reached something in you that needed to be reached, please tell us in the comments. Tell us about the Dorothys in your life. Tell us about the things you carry that other people have not learned to see. Tell us about the moment someone finally looked at you directly and said, "I see you. I should have said so sooner." We read every comment, and we are grateful for every single one of you. If this story belongs to someone you love, share it with them tonight. Because some stories are not just meant to be watched. They are meant to be given.